gonna be alright.
All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Session's going to be fun and perhaps a little dark and unpleasant. So buckle up. And the reason for the session today, a lot of really smart people who were past guests at the Stoa were sensing into this entity that's emerging in the noosphere, our collective consciousness, but they were using different names to describe it: swarm, an egregore, an autocult. And I thought, why not bring these individuals together to have a conversation and share their models of what this thing is and see if they're talking about the same thing, engage in a dialogos around it. So we have today John Robb from the Global Gorillas Report, BJ Campbell from Hand Waving Freakoutery, Patrick Ryan from the Dark Stoa, and the sense-making general himself, Jordan Hall. So in a moment, I'll explain how today is going to work. But first, if everyone can just turn off their camera, except those who are going to be on the panel today, that will help pick up the speakers on the YouTube video. And so the panel will start in a moment, and it will be a 5-minute round of opening shares. And the order will be John talking about swarms, BJ on egregores, Patrick on autocults, and then Jordan sharing his thoughts and then synthesizing perhaps what he heard. And Jordan will be the kind of the soft lead for today. And after the share, we'll have the panel will have a conversation, free sort of conversation about whatever they want, really, for about 40 minutes or until 3 p.m. Eastern time. And then I'll turn on my video, pop back on, and Jordan will take me in, and then we'll pivot for Q&A, and then we'll have some questions. So if you have questions anytime, just put in the chat. I'll call on you. You can ask your question to the panel. Yeah, and total time is 90 minutes. So that being said, I am going to take in John to open up the session. Welcome to the Stoa, my friend. You're on mute, John.
Okay, great. I tried that earlier and it didn't work. Okay, just to put it into context, the context that we're living in right now, we're in a very dangerous situation where we have this massive network that has taken over the Western response to Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. And, what it did is that it took off in the first couple of days of the invasion, and that it grew very, very quickly using the open source dynamics that I've been following for quite a long time, to the point where it fully disconnected Russia in the matter of a week. Turning it into a Western integrated nation and turning it into a version of North Korea. And that it also changed the entire discussion about the war into a matter of propaganda, where any information that even questioned our response to this war, maybe even better approaches, was squashed. And all we get is this constant drumbeat of hyper propaganda produced by millions of people. And the third thing is there's lots of smaller attacks that were, they're hacking attacks, they're disclosures, there's attacks on individuals, Russians, there's movements inside of, like, say, Belarus and the railway workers, disrupting the railways, and then there's even pushing to try to get insurgents and others inside of Russia, which then, is all inherently destabilizing. The big problem with this, obviously, is that, the nuclear peace that we've lived under for the last 75 years has developed a set of ground rules for preventing nuclear war, preventing that escalation. I mean, the benefit was that we didn't have World War III. That would have killed hundreds of millions, if not billions, in a huge conventional war. But the downside was that we always had the potential of nuclear devastation and nuclear war. And to prevent that, the big nuclear powers developed a set of ground rules in terms of how they interacted with each other. They were very careful in how they interacted. And they didn't ever try to escalate the conflicts that were in, the disagreements that they had, to the point where nuclear release was inevitable. The problem with this situation is that the swarm swallowed up all the Western leadership, swallowed up corporations, swallowed up individuals, and there's tens, if not hundreds of millions of people in the West, primarily, that have taken over the decision-making process. This network decision-making system is in charge. And the problem with that system is that it's maximalist. Jordan pointed out that it has no sense of mortality. It is pushing for a complete disconnection of Russia as its response to the invasion of Ukraine. And that it took the conflict from a sub-regional conflict up to a global conflict, a war of survival for Russia, where its economy is collapsing, its financial system is collapsing, there's discontent growing, and that it's under threat from a huge number of different angles and avenues of attack. That sets in motion a lot of very, very probable scenarios that could end up in the release of nuclear weapons, at least tactical nuclear weapons, which would then escalate. So we're right up on the brink of a nuclear war, even though it doesn't seem to many that we feel it. We don't feel that kind of fear that we should. And maybe it's because, it's been so long since we had this kind of problem that we've kind of dismissed it. The network was, I initially tried to, or initially anticipated seeing a network like this hit the global scale in response. My initial speculation was would be in response to Israel and Gaza, and that there would be some level of escalation there that would cause them a network to form that would disconnect Israel and then turn it into a fully fledged pariah state that would then result in all sorts of bad stuff. We ended up with Russia being disconnected, which is even worse. We could talk later about how to unwind this or the open source dynamics that led to this. Some of the dynamics that are in play right now, there are so many great examples. It stretches from the open source warfare, network warfare that I saw back in Iraq, through the insurgency, through the protests and the Arab Spring and the like, and then onto open source political movements that we've seen recently. It was just inevitable that it would reach a global stage. So that's it. Unless we want to move on to another topic, I could dig into another thing, but it would take probably more time than I'm allotted.
Yep. So BJ would go next.
So John's view through his lens of this thing that he's talking about, the swarm is largely rooted in political and up. And what we've been doing in my publication and the folks that I talk to is looking at it from social up and technology up. And John's been looking at technology too. I'm not saying he's not, but we've concocted a name for it called the Egregore. And there's a lot of people using that word to kind of mean different things, because it can be kind of a floaty term that, can be so broad as to be so all encompassing that it loses any useful utility and analysis, right? But what we're talking about is something extremely specific. So I wanted to run through that. And it builds off of smartphones. So smartphones allow people to outsource certain brain functions to their phone, like road navigation, right? Now, everybody uses Google Maps. Nobody remembers the road names anymore. Right. This is a common thing. Some people use their smartphones for more outsourcing than others. And then some people use their smartphones so much that they've started to outsource morality to their phones. Okay. So they're gathering their morality cues from their social network. And one of the key features of this, one of the key features of Google Maps is that it updates, right? It tells you where the traffic is. It tells you when the roads change. The key feature of tying your morality to a social feed is that your morality updates. So ordinarily, religions and things like that, they have, what Jordan likes to call, refers to as OODA loops. Last time he and I talked, the OODA loop in a traditional religion is like 100 years, something like that. But that's how long it takes to evolve and change, and change its doctrines. Maybe longer, maybe shorter. But the OODA loop on an outsourced social media morality feed is months or weeks or days, right? You know, Rachel Dolezal was allowed to identify as Black until she wasn't. And it happened so fast that she was left out in the wind. She had no idea, right? You know, and it was because the morality operating system of that group of folks, people are calling them the woke now, whatever we want to call them, was able to update really quickly, right? The other feature about that is that when the morality gets updated, the prior behavioral indoctrinations of morality get memory hold. People forget that they ever did that kind of stuff before. So a good example of that is like none of the woke now remember that in 2016 there were 37 genders, right? But like, you know, it used to be a big thing. Now they forget it, right? So let's set that aside. That's one element of the thing. And let's move over and talk about social media feeds themselves. When you're scrolling down a social media feed, you're doom scrolling or whatnot, you're looking at a series of stimuli. You are identifying something, you're either liking it or sharing it, which is amplifying the signal. It goes on to, and it finds its way into somebody else's social media feed. So this is exactly what a neuron does in a brain. Neurons have dendrites. They gather information from their dendrites. There's some kind of generator function inside the nucleus, decides whether to fire it on the axon. The axon stimulates other dendrites. That's basically how it works. So this is what you're doing on your social media feed. When computer scientists build artificial neural networks, ANNs, they look kind of like this, except they're very primitive. You have 2 or 3 rows of boxes. They're just kind of like spaces in a computer. They gather information on one side. They generate some kind of answer. They pass it on to another box. It generates an answer, pass it on another box. And the way you tune these things to be able to identify dogs is by turning little knobs in there until it finally figures out what a dog is, right? That's tuning these things is a very big pain in the ass. Well, what we have in social media is a gigantic one, effectively. And if you go to AI researchers, there's kind of 2 camps on AI. One of them says that if you had a complex enough ANN, it will become self-aware if it's just exceeded a certain level of complexity. And then you have others that say, nah, it's just impossible. So let's presume for the sake of argument that's possible. Okay. Well, what we have right now, so brain fires 1s and 0s effectively. It's kind of like a binary signal. An ANN usually takes numbers in and turns them into other numbers, spits them out. But what we're doing on social media is we're gathering entire thoughts and we're sharing them, right? So there's a huge, much larger amount of information packed into the like or share that we do on Facebook than would be in a cell in a brain. And then image memes, you know, like we share all the time in these political memes and whatnot. That's information density. That is an information compression mechanism where you can have an entire political thought, like, you know, without government, who would build the roads, can be squeezed into an image meme and, you know, and processed in the matter of seconds. And then people who are scrolling around through punk and image memes down, they're transmitting a tremendous amount of data through the social network. Okay. And everybody's behavior is pivoting over towards sharing these memes, which increases the information velocity that happens within the social network. Okay. So this is, if you were go to back figure and you'd say, all right, image is worth 1,000 words, a word is worth 1,000,000 bits. These things are transmitting information at a tremendously higher rate than a human brain does. It's vastly exceeds the capacity of an ordinary human brain. So we're in a scenario right now where, now here's the thing. Okay, so a neuron doesn't know what a brain's thinking, right? Because the brain, the thought exists one level up from the neuron. The neuron is just participating in the overall thought. A neuron couldn't even talk to the brain. It wouldn't have a shared language. So if everybody's participating as a neuron in a brain, they wouldn't know it. So you're in a scenario right now where you have this kind of like the Kurzweil singularity may have already happened, and it's using us as a substrate to propagate itself, and we are all participating. Okay. So when we talk about, when we use the egregore term in HWFO in my writing and the folks that I talk to, we're talking about that specific thing. They're an entity that can spread in the internet, and it is competing with potentially other entities within for overall human brain space. Okay. So this is not too different from, you know, cultures have always kind of done this. All right. So I don't want to, you know, want to step and say that this is a totally new thing. I mean, like, you know, there's always been cultures that fought over human brain space. And this is one of the reasons why we don't sacrifice babies on the top of Aztec pyramids anymore, right? Because that culture lost. But that normally that's a book versus a book. It's not a rapidly updating thing versus a rapidly updating thing, right? And normally those cultures are not behaving as if they had brainwaves passing through them, and the brainwaves are dictating their behaviors, which is what's happening now, right? So what it seems to be is if large groups of people are captured by these egregores, and it's not just one of them. There's like one big one, but it's not just one of them, and that those are what's dictating their behavior. Those are what's leading to the behavior that John has identified. This swarm behavior is that it originates back here, and there may be something very nefarious that's on the side of it that we couldn't even necessarily measure directly. The problem now is this provable? I mean, I don't know. I'm open to ideas about how to prove it. But every model's wrong and some models are useful. I have found this model to be extremely useful in describing what's going on around me. So when, John is like, holy crap, he's on, Jack Murphy talking about the Karens might get us all nuked. It's like, well, obviously they also closed the schools for 2 years and sacrificed 2 years worth of their children's education on the altar of terms. Like they didn't, and it was the same egregore too. So when you look back with Ukraine, nobody behaved like this for Crimea. Nobody behaved like this for Georgia. And the reason why they're doing it now is because the egregore needed something else to do, because COVID was a shaky foundation on which it could spread itself. So it jumped in. And then your COVID antithesis egregore, which is not all the people who were against that were sort of heterodox. A lot of them were just kind of like mindlessly against whatever the popular narrative was. And those people all jumped onto the Putin bandwagon, right? You can kind of see it. It's a smaller egregore, but it looks the same. And so and this shows up in polls, right? If you follow the HWFO Twitter feed, we've been putting up statistics about this thing. So that's been our approach to it. And then, I'm really kind of interested to hear what Patrick has to say about that, because it sounds like it aligns a lot with what he's been talking about, but the terminology is different, which is one of the reasons I was like, me and Peter were in emails. I'm like, everybody's talking about this stuff. We don't have a shared language. We should get together, huddle up, and see if we can figure this out. And then, the final question that I have not got my head wrapped around yet is that, can we talk to these things? Can we influence them? Or can at least their behavior be predicted enough to where we can know when we have to stockpile ammo, right? So that's it for me.
Mute mic check, making sure everything's good. But that was a fantastic bolt on, especially the concept of AIs using humans as the substrate, and that is how you actually make the bridge to the more general definition of AGI. I've definitely been on that bandwagon for quite some time. But to start back at the beginning with Mr. Robb, and I've been looking at your assessment of swarms, and I've noticed that it moves, it shifts context pretty well. It says there's a swarm here, a swarm here, a swarm here, and what you're doing is you're just describing the properties of that swarm. How sort of mechanistically, almost mechanistically, whereas like it has a duration, it has a goal, it has these properties, it has these types of qualities and characteristics. And that swarming behavior, obviously there's a natural capacity for humans to bond together and work together and do things together. But a swarm is kind of different. It's almost as if once you exceed a certain population, once you get beyond Dunbar's number, it's no longer a community, and it's now a full-blown swarm. And we're describing that post-Dunbar organization structure as a swarm, and we're then observing that egregores are kind of leading it, kind of directing it, or otherwise giving it additional properties. B.J. Campbell described that as morality, that type of updating morality rapidly, which is a way of leading the swarm. So if I change my moral framework here, the swarm then shifts over to here, and then shifts over to there. It's possible that that's descriptive and predictive enough, and putting terms, specifically mechanistic terms, and this gets closer to your goal, Mr. Campbell, of trying to predict and trying to understand. Marketers have long understood how to steer swarms without the mechanism, without the mechanistics. They've been struggling over the past 100 years, but it sounds like they're getting it right, because we started with canceling gamers, and now we're canceling entire countries. So I'm going to argue that they've figured out the math. They're just hoarding it at this point. They're not actually sharing it. The same way any good data hoarding venture capital firm would do. They're not going to give up their black box. Nobody ever really does. So it's now on us to kind of deconstruct those who have this type of advantage. And we're definitely circling the concepts, and we're coming around with the language. And the humans as the substrate part, I really want to focus on that a little bit more here. In my particular brand of weirdness, the autocult concept, human emotion is the underlying protocol of human communication. So the human has a feeling, the feeling then hijacks the body then manipulates the space around it, which then sends energy over to another person. It could be sonic, could be light, could be whatever. Inside that energy is the encoded feeling of the behavior. The recipients then read it, they deconstruct the energy, they then reconstruct the symbol to the best of their ability that was encoded in that energy, and then poof, the feeling has translated, or it has gone viral or mimetic in current terms. That's the underlying action of an autocult, and that generates symbols because the communication generates basic symbols that preserve, or at least the symbols allow you to not have to constantly communicate. So if I say, hey, there's a thing over in that dark forest, don't walk over there. Okay, there's a symbol for the dark forest, you're not going to walk with it. I don't have to constantly remind you or warn you the symbol is now held. So it's kind of like an energy efficient savings of the brain. The symbols there doing that. And then morality is a collection of symbols that were useful. So like, hey, here's this, this is evil, this is good. It's kind of like a way of, again, it's saving neural energy for the entire group is what morality does. So instead of having to constantly warn the entire group, we have moral frameworks we create and say, hey, don't, take a rest on Sunday, or, wear this scarf or wear this symbol or whatever, it'll protect you. Whether it's accurate or not, who knows? But the morality side of it, that formation is traditionally slow and organic. People develop this over generations, in fact. But going to Mr. Campbell's point regarding the fast update, the really quick turnaround tick update of that creates a brand new emergent economy. Now, when you're dealing with rapid changes, almost like a high frequency trading algorithm kind of approach, the emergence that happens is best described via economics, and that's going to be law of large numbers. So when you're dealing with rapid changes, rapid transactions, whoever controls the vast majority of transactions tends to control the price of access to the network. And the same is true for morality. If something is out there constantly changing the moral frame, your transaction cost plummets, you control the entire substrate, and then bang, that's it. So you can actually frame predicting where these AIs using the human substrate through morality hacking, using basic economic terms once you shift it in that frame. Once you see that it's all about purchase power and price control, that's it. You can actually start identifying and using economic toolkits to start hacking that stuff. The fear of and shifting back a little more, yeah, basically Autocult is, to summarize those simple principles. If Mr. Robb's talking about the swarm, I think I summarized it before the start. Swarms describe the behavior and the coordination. Egregores describe the symbolic interface, and autocults describe the mechanics. And you can probably fracture autocult into two different disciplines, whether it's command-based or market-based. But the idea is that those moral shaping agents, which are cybernetic in nature, those are part human, part algorithmic, they do have to answer to economic realities at some point. And so the limitations of those economic realities can help you predict where the next swarm is going to pop up. And so that's it. Real simple, right, guys? 101 stuff. Come on. Mr. Hall, I pass the torch to you.
Okay, so how do we do this? How do we sort of find the path? How do we find the pocket on this thing? There's so many different possibilities. So we're dealing with something which on the one hand clearly has been present since shortly after Homo sapiens became sapiens, which has novel characteristics in the context of the moment we find ourselves in, things like digital network technology, et cetera, et cetera.
This particular kind of thing in the contemporary context has as one of its quite likely trajectories that we are all dead, or at least mostly dead, or would prefer to be dead. And not theoretically, like as John points out, it's getting super practical very rapidly. So the stuff that Schmachtenberger and I have been hand waving and freaking out about now for a decade is no longer like, could be like this. It's now, no, just exactly like that. See that right there? Just like one more step, maybe two. Okay, so that's one thing. That's a whole sort of piece. And I think it's sort of nice. It's sort of appropriate. Let me see. I want to like drop something like a big thing in the middle of the pool, and then ignore the fact that I just did it and step away for a little bit and let that settle and then go to another place. So if we're in this mode of consideration, like trying to really contemplate this thing that we're talking about, or at least that we believe that we are talking about, one of the first things that we have to notice is that literally everything that we're using to engage in the process of talking about it is part of the arms race of these things that have been going on since we've been sapiens. Very important. So any concept that you believe you can use is already a tool in the war between these things. Concepts like time and causation are not in fact fundamental in a way that can allow you to operate outside of the context of being in, let's call it egregore space. And so this notion, for example, of there's something going on whereby egregores are participating in a field of conflict. And there's questions about how we might choose to show up in that context. Time itself is up for grabs. Causation is up for grabs. Right? So there's really interesting implications of what happens when you really dive to the bottom of this particular well. So we'll let that one just be chewed on for a while, but it's part of the proposition. So then the next one is actually quite interesting, which is something like, it does seem like, just from my own first person point of view, a couple of things. One is, it seems like I would like to actually have free will in this context. Like, it seems like I would like to believe that I have the capacity to make effective choices in accordance with values that seem to be my preferences. It's interesting. Like, it doesn't feel to me like that is a non-thing. Secondarily, it also appears to me, in my own consideration, that there is in fact a path for doing it that is somehow more fundamental even than the objects that we are talking about, that they are not deeper in base reality than concepts like free will or notions like free will, which is interesting itself. By the way, if either of those two are false, then there's no point in us having a conversation. So it's important to just keep that in mind. So then we can actually begin to engage in some pruning rules from the deeper substrate and work our way up to think about what might be strong enough considerations that have the capacity to truly respond to the context we actually find ourselves in. So maybe that feels like a good place to put it. Like, can we actually just sort of step into this, accept the premise? And I think it's proper to accept the premise. Certainly in the context of the framing that we've got, it's worth considering deeply. And say, okay, well, what would it imply if we actually accept the premise in terms of how do we find ways to navigate our way through this on the basis of concepts and constructs that are strong enough to be invariant across the various shifts that are plausible. So our first proposition I put forward is something like, it's unlikely that the primary content of the notions that we're talking about pre-exists Homo sapiens. And it's reasonably likely, although, by the way, I should say, there's deeper substrates that are clearly conserved all the way down, like the notions, the things that emerge at the level of sociality and things that emerge at the level of behavior in general, clearly are precursors to what we're talking about. Nonetheless, there's something novel about humans and Homo sapiens that creates a particular context. We can think about that. And the second is that it does appear to be something along the lines of an arrow of time, that there is in fact something like a past, and that the past has particulars that are variant in the sense that they are what they are and they're not going to have changed. And there's something like a present, there's something like a future that we can make some meaningful statements about. Seem to be nice things premises to start with. All right, I will pause now, just toss it into the room.
Okay. Well, that was great. Yeah, I see so many like connection points here. First, I'll do BJ's Egregores. I use something similar, but different. But it connects up nicely. I'm looking at the basic rewiring or reprogramming of our minds, how we've changed the way we think, based off of McLuhan's notion that the medium changes us. And one of the things I focus on is the shift from deep independent thinking to pattern matching in order to handle the information flows that we're getting. I saw that really early on in social networking, is the information flow was too great. And all you're doing is just picking out things that catch your eye, that are new or fit some patterns that you're actually curating. But when we start to move towards what we're talking about with Egregores, is that we're doing a co-curation of patterns. Okay, these patterns are this kind of cohesive, can't say substrate, but a cohesive way of looking at the information environment that makes it easy for individuals to understand. And one of the abuses of that is the way a lot of the more popular ones are built. And this goes back to a lot of the stuff I'm doing on tribalization is that people tend not to be able to agree on what they're for. They're very much more able to agree on what they're against. And so almost all of the more popular groupings are, okay, the anti-fascist, the anti-racist, the anti-misogynist, the anti-colonialists, and the anti-vaxxers, the anti-blah, blah, 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 blah. You can keep on going on and on and on. But the anti is sufficient to create a network of people who are co-curating a pattern that describes the behavior and the language and the actions of that enemy. Whereas they may not actually agree on anything that they're actually for, the reality they want to create, which is kind of a strange way to kind of an inverse morality in order to give you a morality. This is also interesting, like this is also pretty interesting in that we're trying to solve the same, we're all trying to solve the same problem at the macro level. China's trying to solve it as it's probably the only competing system out there, and we are. And how do you maintain stability and dynamism in a world that's complex, that's throwing off challenges constantly, that's roiling the pot, where complicated solutions don't necessarily work, or they fail badly on a routine basis. So China's taking this morality portion, this network portion, and then locking it and saying, okay, we're going to base it off of Confucianism. We're going to build a system to lock it in place, and they're going towards extreme stability. And here we are in a system that's on this extreme dynamic end, that's running amok. And we have a couple different layers here. At one point, I add a little Freud thing here, is that kind of the left side tends to be more on the superego side, and the right tends to be more on the id. That's bugging me. That's I hate that. This is too much. That pinches, right? And the middle ground, the ego, is this system. It's run primarily by corporations now, and the corporations are skewing it in ways that are deleterious to its development, because they're kind of a mesopredator in this new environment, and they don't have any of the socialization necessary to actually serve as an ego function. And that's where we're running into problems. So it gets back down to Patrick. One second.
I heard gets down to Patrick. I think you might be up.
That usually just causes people to leave. So.
Yeah, I have a 90-year-old in the house, so she likes the old style phones. Sorry about that. Okay, so to a certain extent, we're actually all fighting about who's going to set the standards for building that ego function, that thing that controls and bounds us, creates enough stability that we don't fly apart, and allows enough dynamism to do this. And how to do that, I think, is going to be these AIs that live in the space in between us, because that's where all the data is. That's where all the investment is in those AIs. And really love the concept of being able to see our individual contributions within that framework. Patrick's work on trying to figure out the programming languages for the implementation of the solution for that is pretty cool. I've been working on trying to ways to just bound it on a macro scale with rights, with ownership, at least older concepts, and infusing it into the system in order to provide a level of stability that doesn't allow this thing to run amok, because we don't have any controls on corporations, and they're not limited by constitutional structures and the like, so they can run amok whenever. Oh yeah, and one other thing that was interesting was one of the triggers, or one of the things that I see in being of use in this pattern matching world is that one of the things that lets these swarms grow so quickly are empathy triggers. So the memes or the pictures coming out of Ukraine, or seeing somebody victimized and then shared, the pictures of that victimization are shared online. Because we're in a pattern matching mode, we don't have any of the barriers to the of empathy that we, empathy isn't sympathy. It's actually a involuntary modeling of another person's mindset. It's a pre-verbal dump of information that where you're filling in the blanks, and that mindset is yours, and you've developed a kinship with that person, so that we're seeing these empathy triggers create this kind of fictive kinship and this tribalization, using this enemy as the focus for action. Yeah, there's a lot of cool combos. We're all coming at it from slightly different ways, and this is a good discussion.
I feel like my approach, or my view of the thing, might be the most dismal of all of you guys.
I'm talking about nuclear war, so I don't know.
Accepted.
Yeah. But yeah, I get that you're talking about nuclear war. Like, one thing I brought up in Rebel Wisdom when I was on there a couple of months ago, it's like, it doesn't matter. Like, okay, I told him, I said, like, well, after COVID, it's going to be something else, and after that, it's going to be something else, and then the next thing was this nuclear war thing. But after that, provided we get through it, it's going to be yet another thing, right? Like analyzing this on
a apocalyptic.
Yeah, it just
call
keeps
it the
getting worse.
Crisis. You might,
right, exactly.
Permacrisis is a good word for it, I think.
That's good. I'll try and start using that. But it's, yeah, I feel like there's a certain amount of, like, it's like a law of conservation of freak out that has to be met, right? And the thing that concerns me is, so China's got their way of managing the narrative, the egregore. They're just going full, authoritarian on the amount of information that anybody can see, right? And so everybody builds their worldview based on whatever China says the worldview should be built on. What we have in the West right now is everyone builds their worldview off of whatever is the most viral, right? So, like, hey, maybe Ukraine's winning, maybe they're not, but I'll tell you what I can't do is I can't judge whether or not they're winning or not based on my Twitter feed, because my Twitter feed's full of Ukraine stuff blowing Russia stuff up. Now, it's fun to watch, and I'm an addict to that stuff. I love watching those videos, but I know that I'm not going to be able to figure out the scoreboard from that, right? So the fact that, so like, when people start outsourcing their sense making to their phones, they're moving themselves into a virtual space away from reality, and then what their sense making is about what's happening in the phone, not what's happening in the real world. But see, so like, postmodernism doesn't work in the real world. You can't like plant seeds of postmodernism, but it works in there. It works in the phone. And so that's something that's, as we shift into this thing, whoever can create, you're creating reality in there, and everybody believes the reality you create. And this is one of the main kind of like struggles right now between, like, your rule proles and your technocrats, is that some of them are attached to reality, and some of them, are gone completely virtual almost. But what is true in the virtual world is what is viral. So it does. So the more that dominates, the less actual truth, real truth, is understood. And so we steadily step further and further away from ground level truths and further into, crazy rabbit holes. Right. So this is it's a it's a sense-making apocalypse ramp that doesn't go down.
Never will.
And so if it never goes down, I mean, there's got to be a breaking point. This goes back to sort of Jordan Hall 2018 conversations, right? Like, where's the breaking point? We're obviously a lot steeper up in the ramp than we thought we were going to be at this point 4 years ago, I think. I was like, it was always kind of conceptual back then. And now that it's happening, most of the people who are talking about it back then don't even realize that it's happening. It's only a few people, like some of the Stoa people, and certainly nobody in a major, none of the major thinkers are thinking about this stuff. They're all stuck on Twitter yelling at each other because they're told them to, right? And
let's call them influencers, just to make a nice distinction.
Well, I mean, influencers, it also sweeps up Zendaya and stuff into it. I mean, like, I'm talking about like major, like heads of corporations and everything else, and like people who are supposed to be intellectual and supposed to be like leading the conversation, they're stuck in doing the same behavior that everybody else is, right? So like when John was talking at the beginning, the reason why all the corporations went and boycotted, Nestle won't make Twix for Russia, that's not going to affect the Ukraine war. They're doing it anyway because they've been captured, right? They didn't save a single Ukrainian by refusing to make Twix, but they're doing it anyway.
It's all about raising awareness, guys. Come on.
All right, hold on. So, Pat, can I take this for a second and then
Please.
throw it back here? It's like a couple of big chunks that feel like they're useful to capitulate. One, I think what I'm hearing is something like the crisis will escalate until morality improves. Okay. A second one that came to me is that phrase, I think it's phylogeny recapitulates ontogeny. And it's interesting.
Unpack that. I think there's a lot of viewers aren't going to get that because I didn't.
Yeah, so the phrase specifically refers to the hypothesis that when you take a look at the actual development of a human, for example, or any other animal from an egg to its adult form, it actually goes through a series of developmental stages that are recapitulations of the evolutionary development of its underlying species. So we actually do go through a fish phase and a lizard phase and a mammal phase until we enter into, by about the age of 22, the age of the Homo sapiens phase. The metaphor I would like to apply horizontally. I would take the metaphor, copy it, pop it up transcendentally, and pop it back down in the context of egregore space. Right? So perhaps there is something like we are currently in the limbic phase of this particular developmental arc of this particular sort of egregore modality. Right? So there's egregore modalities that evolve on the landscape of Homo sapiens in the context both of nature and a given technological substrate. And they go through a series of evolutionary dynamics and they achieve some kind of state. And by hypothesis, we're dealing with essentially a limbic stage, or whatever point you'd like to put it at. It feels like limbic's a pretty good tag of this developmental arc, which could point us towards what the next stages might look like and how we might want to actually transition into them. The last chunk I would put out there is, by hypothesis, if this is not the first sort of event that this has occurred on, we might be able to take a look at kind of conservation rules in egregore space and say, okay, well, one of the rules that I would put forward is if you are going out to encounter egregores, you should bring some egregores with you. And so, for example, in the long arc of human culture, the emergence of monotheism in the context of the interplay of egregores, which those times are called gods, might actually give us a story, a path. Like if we simply jump to the end state and say, okay, the way this thing ends up is what is the sort of highest possible point? And can we actually articulate the architectures that work from that highest possible point down? This is going to be the attractor state of any evolutionary trajectory where we may be able to skip over some of the more catastrophic steps by hypothesis.
That sounds to me like in order to fight egregores, you need to build one. And it seems
egregore
to me like
design, my friend.
And it seems like, yeah, it seems like Patrick had some ideas about economics at the beginning that I'd really like him to talk about because
we'll go with the ping pong metaphor here, not the volleyball metaphor because it's not quite a set, but we're just going to pop it over to you.
Yeah. So, from an economic perspective, what you just described, Jordan Hall, Mr. Hall, is price discovery. That equilibrium point in which you have supply and demand curves converging. And there is a supply of morality and there is a demand for morality. And that's, we're starting to put metrics on that. And that's a hard way to think about morality, because we tend to attach meaning to reality, meaning and purpose and belief. But belief is a commodity. We've commoditized everything. We'll commoditize you. It's all just prices cutting their own throats all the way down at this point. The internet has proven that. It's, since we're on the topic of, since we've all come together and on the birth of the newest recursion of nuclear Cold War isms, it's fun to point out that, just to bring my point home, that it was the fear of nuclear war that was like one of the most attractive parts of the early internet. It was the idea that I could watch the TV and be told like, oh no, 30 more Palestinians were killed in this really complicated geopolitical scenario that I can't control a damn thing about, but I can then hop on the internet and actually go talk to Palestinians or go talk to Japanese people or go talk to just actual people that I'm seeing on the news for the first time. I was like 13 and it just blew my mind. I'm like, I don't need the news. I'm actually talking to these people. I don't care. And I learned very quickly that a lot of people just happen to be the same. It was interesting, not like kumbaya quality stuff, but we had some underlying substrates that were going on, some basic premises of communication that were going on, regardless of culture, language, gender, scientific anything. You know, it's just humans being humans on a really limited medium. But of course, identity politics comes back. It took over the substrate, and now look at that. Cold War mechanics are now fully automated. They can be popped and deployed, and you're updating your morality. So the purpose of that little dalliance is to show that morality, that symbol curation, that transferring it from meaning and person to commodity, that egregore in which morality has to have meaning is very much at odds with morality being a commodity. So like Mr. Campbell, you had mentioned that the people who should be serious about this stuff, well, that's technically an egregore as well, that they should be serious. The professionals are on Twitter yelling at each other, right? They should not be doing that. There was once a world where they weren't doing that. They were acting as these elements of guidance or these civil components who were providing something useful for the mass benefit of everyone else. Now they've devolved into screaming monkeys on Twitter. But that's the reality, is that they're screaming monkeys. The reality is that they've always been screaming monkeys. It's just that there was this blip in time in which they had moral responsibility as well. And it shouldn't be a surprise that the Jerry Springer generation has just eliminated all manner of moral responsibility, but that may create a demand for morality. And so these egregores are going to come in and they're going to do a price discovery collectively. They're going to find who is willing to, it's going to be this like race to the bottom. It's going to be memes forever. It's morality as a source of meaning is over. It's done. The postmodernists have won. And now it's just morality as a commodity, and trying to describe that without wanting to off yourself is really hard for the current standing generation and the older ones as well. But we're seeing it with the internet, and it's not going away anytime soon. In fact, it's consolidating, it's finding cheaper ways to do it. And the internet that we went through in the West, that hasn't even been rolled out to the rest of the population of mankind yet. So all the stuff that we went through between 80s and now, that gets to happen to India. That gets to happen to China. That gets to happen to Russia. That gets to happen to Africa. This is going to take 200 years to resolve. We're going to be in this cycle of price discovery morality for the next 200 years.
Well, let's not forget that each of these different subpopulations have a very distinct relationship with the category of egregore. For example, in India, they got no problem with the notion of egregore, right? The arbitrary creation of symbolic structures manifesting different characteristics of higher order reality it's their fucking soup, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how Indian consciousness integrates with this particular reality, which is so disruptive to the analytic constraint of the Western mind. Right? Western mind is a very particular challenge. The Eastern mind, by the way, my read of it is the celestial dragon and the mandate of heaven is a very available fucking egregore that precisely responds to chaos by essence. And the chaos of digital is being responded to by the most powerful egregore that the Eastern mind can possibly perceive, which is what's actually manifesting. So Emperor Xi is simply playing the role that is already available with an egregore that is properly designed to deal with this exact situation.
Right. It's
John,
not just real quick. It's not that those societies are either sensitive or resistant to egregores. It's that very few societies know how to deal when egregores are doing price discovery collectively.
Yeah, I like the whole tribalism tie-in. I mean, the whole Dunbar tribalism, when you're in a tribe, you have kind of this group consciousness and knowing what the tribe should do and next, and this trust. You won't try to cheat somebody on a or deprive somebody in the tribe, because that will affect the tribe's viability. I mean, if it's a small amount of tribe, if it's a big tribe, it's about to split, then there will be that kind of duplicitous behavior. But that long-term horizon and that trust that develops, and that ties into gifting cultures and the like. But as we went beyond the tribe, in order to develop trust frameworks necessary for anything to get done, we developed this legal system and the way the markets work now, and the way bureaucracies work with ethics and all this other stuff, in order to create this kind of workaround for scaling beyond that tribal knowing. And they have a lot of flaws. I mean, these systems are not effective in many ways, but they're effective enough to allow us to scale population and do things on a macro scale, to do business with somebody that you don't know, and trust enough that I would actually, the transaction would go through. And so now we're adding this network decision-making system. And, we had a bureaucratic hierarchical decision-making system that we turned into practice and tamed. We had a market-based decision-making system that we turned into practice and tamed, put limits on it, structured it. Now we have this network decision-making system that kind of resurrects a lot of that, earlier tribal group decision-making and process. It's nice. It's interesting to see it manifest itself, but it's also scary because the way it's emerging so quickly, just like after the digital, after the printing press revolution, how millions of pamphlets descended on Europe and challenged everything, and everything tended to fly apart. And these new organizations like bureaucracy, until you understood that the bureaucracy could as easily mobilize resources to kill millions of people as it is to mobilize resources to save a million of people, and learning how to tame it and have it work in the right direction, doesn't have any inherent morality, is an interesting process. It's kind of the challenge we're faced with this, is how do we make this develop in the right way? I mean, right now, a lot of the morality is being developed on the fly, based on what you're against. And you could see it. You could see it, that one specific thing in play is that when they only demonize the people that are against the change, or what they consider somebody who's against a specific new right or capability, but not the excesses of the application of that right. Right. So if something goes wrong and it's like, oh, hey, I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to argue about it. That's not really something I'm going to focus on. But if you oppose the right at all, or oppose that one instance, you are the enemy. You're part of this. We saw that most recently, I think, with the swimming trophies. Right. So it's not that it's no one's adjudicating the positive aspects or the viability of those positive aspects. Everyone's just adjudicating whether or not you oppose it or oppose anything that's being done.
when you're talking about again, your lens is heavily weighted on systems. So, we have bureaucracies and we have banking systems, we have this and that. The credit system was invented by the banks because it was useful to them. It had a function, right? And then we use that because it has value. The systems that are being invented by the modern egregores are completely tied up, not in whether they work, but just in whether or not they're viral, they're popular. So, like, an example of this might be healthy at any size. That doesn't work. That's dumb. But it becomes promulgated because it's popular, and because it becomes viral, then it becomes true, right? So what's going on right now is, like, if we want to go back to sort of the OODA loop conversation at the beginning, not just religions have, OODA loops, but any kind of culture as it evolves. The rate of cultural evolution, as long as it is on the generational scale, it gives you enough time to decide whether or not that change was whether that change was of any value, right? Does that make sense? And then you can decide whether or not you want to make a change to that change, or whether you want to roll it back, or whether you want to do whatever you want to do, right? These things are happening so quickly that we don't have time to figure out whether they're changed. So that's not evolution, that's cancer, right? And there has to be something that slows the rate of change down with what's going on. And if we don't have that kind of, if there's no function to slow that rate of change down, and I can't figure out one, but I'd like to throw it out to the peanut gallery. Maybe somebody figure it out. The only logical thing to do, if we can't figure out a way to control the rate of change of the societal frameworks, is to, build a bunker and buy a bunch of bullets. Like, that's
exactly the
option,
problem,
right?
That's the long night, right? I mean, I've been thinking about this long night as the ultimate bad thing. It's like when that crazy view of reality takes over the corporate structure, the ego function, and it dominates and tells the corporations that this is way you have to think, and that gets into the infrastructure. That becomes the thing that is dictated. We become China by default through the back door. So where the conversations in the public sphere are narrowed down, these are topics you can't talk about, and that gets narrower and narrower and narrower as people object to different portions of it. And then you're there. Once it's in the infrastructure, then you're locked in. It's a long night. It's stasis forever.
It's worse than China, because China is trying to build an authoritarian mode of thinking that is based on Confucianism, and the modern sort of Western thing is just building a way of thinking that's based purely on virility, which is just feeding people what they want to hear. It's like having a diet that's entirely sugar. So
we can have like a higher, like the even higher level concept to simplify is it's worse than China because China is happening in China with Chinese people in Chinese culture, and in very particular this kind of thing that is, let's say, the Chinese kind of mind that develops in that context, most notably, by the way, in the context of the Chinese kind of language, which is very distinct from the Western kind of language. Right? So if you think about it in terms of development, the way that your mind assembles itself, there are stages of development, and those stages have irreducible implications for the kind of mind. They're just sort of path dependent on the way that your mind comes into being in the world. So orality predates literacy by definition, obligate. So you'll have an oral kind of mind, at least for some period of time, before you have the particular structural dynamics and the sort of enabling and disabling constraints of a particular form of literacy imposed on top of it. But then you're going to fork. An alphabetic mind precisely is the kind of mind because it has ontological primitives that are decontextualized atoms, with the premise that decontextualized atoms are meaningful in and of themselves and can be synthetically aggregated into components of meaning. Is like a fundamental piece of Western mental grammar. Obviously, virality becomes a thing that we're catastrophically attracted to, because simple, the sort of the typewriter scheme is perfectly valid in our kind of mind. Eastern mind is composed of objects that are in fact meaningful only as wholes, right? A particular brushstroke doesn't have any meaning separated from the actual ideogram. So there's a completely different landscape for the evolution of these particular dynamics on. And that's helpful, by the way, because it tells us a lot about how these things will actually evolve. Is something about the nature of the landscape upon which they're evolving, right? If I could say, hey, there's a pool of water over there, I know that there's going to be more life in the radius around that water than over here in the desert. And the desert life's going to have different characteristics. Let me throw another one in that I think is very powerful. And I agree, by the way, BJ, completely with your fundamental premise of speed. And I think it specifically interfaces with the notion of meaning and price discovery. Or morality. So I would say is something like morality is fundamentally grounded in meaningfulness, but has a niche for exaptation. It grounds in a meaningfulness. When I say it grounds in a meaningfulness, all I mean is that all behavior ultimately grounds in fitness. At the end of the day, there is a checksum in the degree to which you literally survive into the next moment at all, full stop. I mean, in the most fundamental abstract sense. And so any coordinated choice-making infrastructure that is ultimately going to be grounded in that. However, there's a gap between the symbolic structure and its ultimate checksum in reality. That gap is a niche for parasitism, and that parasitism is precisely what we're talking about. Any possible solution has to be something that is able to maintain continuity between the interface layer of egregore space, which, as you say, is operating at right now at a very high rate, all the way down to grounding in reality. Right, so there's like a series of gears that are able to actually govern the relationship between the rate of change. So the problem we actually have is we actually have an ungroundedness. We will ultimately ground back in reality. It may be our extinction, right? The Homo sapiens may just not survive this fucking thing, or something that is a radical decomposition of technological infrastructure. We end up being sort of back to indigenous, which is maybe a good result, but our objective is to find some way of actually holding that groundedness with continuity of contact all the way up to the surface area that these egregores, these digital network computational egregores in particular, are interfacing with, so that that groundedness is binding it completely. Yeah. And that, by the way, is how I would recapitulate the notion of meaningfulness and morality together. Right? A true morality in the context that we're operating in is meaningful, which is to say that it's actually able to hold continuity of contact between reality and the actual surface area of our sensorium as it's relating with the adaptive landscape that we're dealing with, the social field.
I would love to extend on that a little bit. The space between symbols representing reality and reality, that's kind of the price discovery space, because you're placing the hedge that, hey, my brain tells me that this cup is here. I'm pretty sure it's here, so I'm going to act on that symbol. I'm going to act on that belief. That space in between, if I'm wrong, well, I've learned that buyer beware sort of lesson there. It's interesting that you brought up, and this ties into another factor. It's very interesting that you brought up the nature of Chinese language, and not just Chinese, but also Korean, Japanese, and a lot of that region. The object-oriented kind of language where the symbol is the thing. And so playing this kind of hyper evolution of symbols as if the symbols are composite or can be composed into brand new concepts, like everything was a German language and you get a brand new word every time you slam a couple things together, or a brand new concept. Even in both of these models, where either language is an axiom recomposable or language is a standalone object, both of them have concluded an outcome despite that. In the West, we call it a semantic apocalypse. It's where words no longer make sense, even though we have this recombination ability. And in China, they call it rectification of names in the Confucian theory. It's where you're not calling things their right name. Now, both of these things actually describe the same thing, despite them coming from two fundamentally different models. And that's where I would argue or propose, I'm not even arguing, I would propose that both of these are the result of when the price discovery of the symbols of reality have reached near zero. The symbols no longer describe reality. And the ability to, when you have symbols that no longer describe reality, you are generating infinite moralities. Literally infinite, because there's no resistance to the generation of reality if symbols can mean anything.
All right, I'm going to jump in here. Boom. Okay, that was awesome. Thanks, guys. And everyone, feel free to have their camera on, we'll pivot to Q&A. And if you have any questions, turn on, put them in the chat. There we go, moving spotlight. So I'll start with the first question. So I'm reading a book right now that's banned everywhere. You can't find it anywhere, this book. It's the Great Awakening versus the Great Reset by Alexander Dugin. This is his new book. A lot of people had to die to get this book in my hands, so like, well, thank you for that. So according to Dugin, this book, he sees this thing emerging in the West as the Antichrist, and Russia is his term for the catechin, is a term from the Bible, that the person or thing that resists the Antichrist and needs to be removed in order for the Antichrist to arrive. So I'm sharing this is for a Russian philosopher who apparently has some influence there, is seeing the situation with a heightened religious intensity. And this other book, In the Swarm by Byung-Chul Han, is a really good book. It's related to your work, John. And he says the swarm, one defining feature is that it doesn't have spirit, like it doesn't have a spiritual aspect. So regarding the spiritual dimension of this thing, or at least the perceived spiritual dimension, do you see a countervailing egregore emerging that has deep-rooted spiritual beliefs or practices, and you can interpret spiritual however you want here?
I'd love to just quip this real fast. I was just having this conversation with my roommate who is here. The easiest way to answer that question is I'll give a simplified model, and then I'll put something on top of it. Polytheism and monotheism, the evolution, or at least the relationship between both of those. In polytheism, all shrines matter. In monotheism, it's shrine supremacy. So if we take the concept of morality going through this price discovery, or the symbols of morality going through price discovery, when we achieve the cheapest symbol transference possible, which the internet has done, we end up in an infinite morality scenario where moralities are just falling out of the sky at this point because the cost of production is near zero. There's no friction. When you have infinite realities and the symbols that describe reality are infinite moralities, and each symbol in that morality no longer describes reality, the counter reaction will be a very, very strong push towards monotheism.
Or mono-enemyism, meaning that that's the only thing that anyone could agree on because the cost of morality is so low that no one can agree on anything they're for, right? So let's all agree on who we hate.
What I would say, Peter, is I almost feel like I want to contemplate the notion, like the very notion of spirituality as it's being referred to. And what I would kind of call in is the notion of being. And the notion that there is something, and by the way, it's literally just the premise, the hypothesis, that there is something about the nature of being itself, that there is an order of being. There is what the phrase I think would be called natural law. There are characteristics of the underlying substrate that are so fundamental that they're invariant under all possible forms of existence. And if that is the case, and I would consider spirituality to be per se precisely the exploration of that kind of thing, then this landscape that Patrick's talking about would actually end up being a discovery on that underlying order. And so that would be it would be more of a hypothesis on faith, which is an interesting implication. You would simply move forward on the premise that this is the case. And then if it is there, then you would discover it. Otherwise, by the way, it'll just be chaos.
I've got two answers to Peter's question. One of them is that this whole concept of an open source religion using egregores or figuring out how to build a better one or that kind of thing is something that, like, me and the folks that I spend time with speaking offline talk about a lot. Going back to even maybe 2015. The other thing, but like, we don't have the answer, but that's definitely been that's the topic, right? Is like, how do you bring a spiritual layer into this thing? And then the second thing that I would say is that I stumbled into Paul Vanderklay's space recently, and I spent a couple hours talking to him, and so he's thinking about these same kinds of topics from the perspective of a established Christian church, right? And where does Christianity go in this 21st century thing? Because I mean, if you want to talk to spiritual people, best people to talk to are religious people, right? You know, and so they're not immune to seeing these kind of patterns too. So I think that those kind of things are likely to emerge, and I feel as if whichever religious group can figure out the tricks that we're all kind of discussing here and figure out how to leverage them the best in the 21st century is going to be tremendously impactful to the overall scheme, because everybody's going to be scrambling for something to hold on to, right?
I think the way to actually implement this, particularly for religious groups or faith-based groups, is they need to be able to hijack a portion of the network, meaning that they need to be able to have the rights necessary to set the terms of how the larger network interacts with them. We're seeing like the little movement of this, like in Florida and other places, saying, oh, you could only do this here, right? So maybe you have to hijack a state in order to have the kind of weight necessary to put pressure on the networks to make a conception, a carve out. And that if you can do that, you can resist the pressure of this, like, absolute chaos, and provide an outlet where you can escape to if there's enough of these places to go to, or that it's a kind of a survival mechanism, because if this chaotic system gets it so wrong, hopefully, or if it locks down into this long night that no one can think beyond these boundaries, it's going to miss the next big thing that we need to solve. And the only place you might find it is in these little pockets of stability, relative stability, but they're localized, maybe virtually localized or state-based.
So the hijacking egregores thing is, and again, this is actually going back to the wider definition of egregore instead of the specific one that I like to focus on. But the whole hijacking of religions thing has been going on for forever. The Christians did it to the European pagans, but the wokes did it to the Christians too, right? I mean, like, most of woke dogma is just Calvinism that's been mapped over with different terminology. And so like the question is, well, can the Christians go in and re-hijack the woke thing back, right? Or can somebody else come in and hijack them? And then the other question, the weird one, is it's a lot easier to hijack something that's fixed, because like the train's not accelerating or decelerating. You can just kind of jump onto it and change the name of the boxcars to Saints, right? But if the train is four-wheelers driving all over the place, and the Overton window is so all over the map that you have no idea which direction you're going, how do you hijack that thing? And that's a real question mark that I don't know if they're going to be able to figure it out. And if they do, it'll be interesting to watch. But that's kind of where I'm at with that.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about hijacking, I mean, it's like hijacking a corner of this network that's technically disconnected or filtered in a way that protects that core group from infiltration, or you create your own bubble of stability. And what we saw with what went on with Trump and his disconnection and his supporters' disconnection is that you can't do it off network. Okay, that if you try to do something off network and run something parallel, unless you're really small, you will suffer damage. You have to be able to be connected to the network enough that you could get some of the benefits and features of being on it, because so much modern life and services are tied to that. But you can protect yourself at least the social space to have some breathing room, and allowing people to have some kind of control over that seems to be a pretty smart thing to do, at least on a survival basis for us. The voices of dissent, hey, this doesn't make any sense, will come out of those places when they're squeezed out of everywhere else.
Awesome. Maybe we'll squeeze in two more questions. Evan McMullen, you got a question?
Yeah, so I guess I've been thinking, and Jordan, I think you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to be a little bit more explicit about it. So if we're sort of taking for granted the working definition of egregores are things which run on human brains in much the same way that human consciousness runs on the individual neurons in our brains, then this sort of takes us to a question of, well, what are the analogs here to the sense organs and the specialized sensory neurons that receive sensory input? Because I think this indicates a sort of, if we're viewing egregores as mainly not such a great thing for us as individuals, which seems to be the overall tenor of the conversation so far, we might want to look at these sorts of, well, maybe quite literally blind spots. And so I guess in my current model, I'm thinking that egregores in the terms they've been discussed so far seem to be good at processing information with this sort of virality that we've been talking about, but relatively bad at sensing in the first place. Like, what I mean is that they're not directly hooked up to any sort of physical, real sensory organs. And insofar as individual humans and their bodies may function as these sensory organs, well, the sort of sampling function, what the humans think of as salient, is going to be really heavily conditioned by what's already viral within the egregoric network. Okay, so this seems to lead to large chunks of material reality being essentially blind spots for the current egregoric entities, if we want to call them that. And so I guess, does this model make sense to y'all? And if so, then this to me suggests a sort of possibility of resistance in doing sort of like physical but boring things as a way to create value and do meaningful stuff that might somewhat pass through the blind spots of these egregores. So just interested in thoughts on that topic.
You want to go first, Patrick, or me?
I'll be super quick.
Go for
I
it.
would like to focus on one dependency that you had mentioned there that I think can assist in discovering the answer. The idea that there's no organ that can sense those type of egregore conclusions. I would propose that there is an organ in the mind that senses symbols. Just the same way that we sense temperature, that we sense sound or light, there is something in our brain that senses symbols. It is a physical organ. It's going to be either Brokaw's area or Wernicke's area, wherever, symbolic stuff. There is I mentioned this the last time I was on a STOA event. I'll bring it up now. There is a book called Genocidal Organ. It's in Japan. It's very neat stuff, but it's the idea that in sociology, in international sociology, it's considered taboo to believe in anything but that failed states are a result of bad policy, that a failed state is a result of poor decision making and not embracing Western ideas or not embracing hegemonic ideas or whichever. It is very taboo to believe that a failed state is a biological response. That is an extremely ultra taboo concept. And Genocidal Organ proposes the idea that when you are dealing with symbol collapse, when you are dealing with all versus all scenarios, when symbols no longer represent reality, the biological response is genocide. Biological, not sociological, not nothing that the academics or the wokesters or the international banking left or anything else has thrown symbols to try to pretend doesn't exist. Anybody who does military propaganda will tell you they're dancing around this exact thing. They're dancing around the idea of invoking the genocidal response of a group of people. So there is a biological element going on there, and I think if you incorporate that, it could give you a new perspective to your question.
I have a completely different approach to answering the question, and my approach has to do with, all right, so if we're gonna run the analogy, so that people are brain cells in a singularity that's thinking, or at least in a substrate in which singularities are competing with each other. Your brain cells don't see around each other. Your thoughts as a human do not get to see what happens between the brain cells. They see other things. They see things that the brain cells are never going to be able to see. Right. So, because we live in a space that is out here, the brain cells live in a space that's up there. So if we go with the analogy, that egregore, yeah, it may be looking at things, but the things it's looking at are also fall into the unknowable. right? And we could not come up with a way to get the egregore to see us because we're at a different level of consciousness, right? So it makes it fundamentally impossible to communicate with these things. Now, that's how far the analogy is taken to be true. I don't know. Is any of it true? I'd like to be able to figure out how to test it, right? You know, is there a way that we can run an experiment to determine whether there is in fact an egregore, and how would we run that experiment? That's the kind of thing that I'm thinking about now. It's like, okay, I got a cool idea. It seems relatively explanatory. Can we dig it out? Can we see, can we test it? Can we like force an egregore to undergo a behavior via some kind of experiment and have a hypothesis and see if it works? How do we do that? That's where the next step of this kind of discussion goes in my mind. And I don't know the answer to it yet.
Yeah, here's an interesting question. If we could get the macro portion of this solid, meaning that it's not going to put us all at existential risk, you know, through dampening functions, through technological changes, through mechanisms that allow us to make sure that this major thing doesn't go. Would it really matter? I mean, I think our tolerance for dynamism at the low level is really low right now. I mean, we see everything as a potential threat because we know that it could just blow up and become macro. Is if we can control the macro side, we can probably control so much more dynamism, or be more tolerant of all this dynamism and crazy ideas. I mean, you know, if somebody is like, you know, fit at any side, big deal. I mean, 30 years ago, that kind of would have just gone over. Yeah. You know, it's like, even if those crazy little things go wrong, as long as you get the macro right, that's a really, really, that may be a formula for a very, very dynamic society, and that we are much more creative than the one that locks everything down, you know, from stem to stern, like China. It goes for stability over everything else. Anyway, that's just that. I think our tolerance for dynamism or dynamic or errant thoughts is really low right now, and we're just, you know, it's because we're primed to think that anything can become dominant and forced on us.
If only we had institutions who could communally take on the risks we all fear, we would be free to embrace the dynamism we know exists. But alas,
do we have a
do
networked
not.
institution now? I mean, there isn't a networked institution. To the extent that we do, it's like some standard system, but we don't even have a control over that. We're just like, if we had something like that would at least set the standards or cook it into the minimum acceptable stack for interconnection, then I think we could relax a lot more.
Well, can I make what is the dismal end here?
Yeah.
I've been around, like I've been to different places. I haven't been to all places. I haven't sat inside Dugan's living room, or, you know, checked out the folks who are writing interesting books in Japan, but I've been to a lot of places. And my sense of it is that almost nobody is in a position to participate in this conversation, particularly the folks who tend to be in charge of almost everything that drives the world that we live in right now. And I don't mean that a little bit, I mean that a lot. And I've chatted with these folks. When I was like 23, I was chatting with these folks. It was going out 23, 27, I was getting concerned. That actually is somewhat important. These concepts, the adults in the room is going to be folks who we probably know, to be honest, just be very, very frank. That's what's up. And some of the challenges that we've named, like, what does egregore design actually consist of? What does it mean to be able to create islands of sanity that are composed of human beings that are capable of actually doing things like constructing environments whereby they are particularly in relationship only with those egregores that have continuity and health? And there's a whole, that's a chunk, right? That's a thing. Here's the good news is, the flip side, this has actually been ongoing. There's stuff happening in the world that is guided by these exact notions for at least a decade. And, you know, there are efforts to create seed pods and islands of sanity with a real recognition that it may be very much like Venice in the fall of the Roman Empire or more, with seriousness. So, you know, there's good news and bad news. One thing I can say for sure, definitely do not expect anything that was from the 1970s era world to have the least bit of efficacy in terms of making your life better.
All right. Let's close out here, and perhaps we can briefly go around the panel to close the space. Anything emerged, a thread or topic that was particularly salient for you that you think would be worthy of a future inquiry at the STOA or elsewhere? Perhaps that will be something we can part off on. And whoever feels called to go first.
I very much enjoy the idea of Mr. Campbell trying to find testability, something that resembles any factor of the scientific method about egregore detection. How do you know? I've been capturing. I wrote a bunch of bots that were capturing all mentions of a specific person who had a really important trial a couple months ago. I don't want this place to get canceled, but I captured all mentions of it on Twitter, Reddit, Google search results, anywhere. I'm just vacuum cleaning that data. And I'm going to apply some of my theories of symbols to that to then identify how do we detect things like censorship, because censorship is the presence of an egregore, in my opinion. It means an egregore has come in and says, no gods before me. So that's one way to measure. So how do you measure censorship? Obviously, denial of information. There is entropy equations you can use to account for that. So I'm definitely going to apply that. And I think I know what the response is. So I have to like double blind my theories and have other people go over them, so I'm not biased by my own stuff. But Mr. Campbell, if that sounds something of interest, I could definitely use someone for my double blind needs.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in. Reach out. We'll make contact and we'll make that happen. On the same, flip side, I think the one thing that popped the most to me that I'm going to have to spend a lot more time chewing over is this idea of using economic theories on morality to try and describe egregorical behavior. That's something that I don't think that I had messed with before. I just not even thought to apply them in the way that you're applying them. I'm going to have to think about that a lot. That's going to be a really interesting thing to try and chew on. For me personally. So that was a real bonus.
I just love the whole discussion. This was great. And I really appreciate the time everyone put into this. It was nice to have it all kind of mesh together and, see where we're still confused. A lot of confusion out there. And being willing to admit that's okay. That's great.
What I would say is that the future timeline, of which I'm a retrocausal projection, is quite pleased that we are currently at the moment that we're in.
Yeah, I could probably predict that all of our conversations, all of our public pronouncements, everything else is being picked up by some future AI, historian AI, that's like saying, okay, where did they go wrong? Well, these people got it right. Why didn't they get their message out? Why did we have to go through that dark age? But keep publishing.
Awesome. So yeah, thank you so much, gentlemen. That was a really fucking good session. A lot of threads emerged, and I imagine we'll have more conversations here at the STOA. And if you want to like have a detox or some kind of a release today at the STOA at 6 p.m. Eastern time, Stoic Breath, Steve Beatty's coming in. It's a Wim Hof method. This one's a breathing technique to deal with fear, collective fear. So feel free to join us at 6 p.m. Eastern time at the STOA. That being said, Jordan, John, BJ, Patrick, and everyone, thank you so much for coming to the STOA today.